Together, and we say that there is truly nobody like you, no one greater. We love you, Jesus, today. You may be seated.
This is John 21, 1 through 22. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them. And they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out and got into the boat. But that night came and they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore. But the disciples did not realize it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you caught any fish?" They said, "No." "Throw your net on the other side," he said, "of the boat, and you will find some." Then they said, "We were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish." Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It was the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard them say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and he jumped into the water. The other disciples followed him into the boat, towing the nets full of fish, for they were not far from the shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire burning of coals there with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you have just caught." So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the 3rd day Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The 3rd time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the 3rd time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things, and you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself, and you went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death which Peter would glorify God. And then he said to him, "Follow me." Peter turned and saw that the disciples whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and said, "Lord, who is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" Jesus answered, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is it to you? You must follow me."
This is a moment for me. The last time I was asked to speak or asked to preach in a regular Trevecca chapel was more than 3 decades ago. I don't know exactly what that says about my preaching. But the last time I was a senior at Trevecca, about to graduate, and I had recently returned with a class from Trevecca from the country of Haiti. And that trip had made me rethink everything about my life right before graduation. I've often told the story through the years about that sermon because it was one of my first, and I was super nervous. Chapel used to meet in Benson Auditorium. And so when I finished speaking that day, I slipped out through the backstage curtains, and while they sang a final song, I went out the backstage door and went back to my room so that no one would talk to me about anything that I had said. But I had just been to Haiti, and my heart was super full. My heart had been broken by the things that I had seen there. I had never seen such human desperation, such levels of poverty. We had driven on a bumpy truck through villages where the streets were lined with human sewage, and people would crowd out of houses, and they told us that the houses were so small that the children had to sleep in shifts for everyone to fit in the house. And everywhere we had been chased by beggars and had people wanting something from us at every moment, and my heart was just broken. So that whole time I had wrestled with my own smallness, with my inability to bring anything to the equation that would help anything in Haiti. The need was just too great. And little by little, day by day, experience by experience on that trip, my heart had become overwhelmed with the world's pain. It was almost paralyzing. Not unlike the way some of you might feel today, with so much wrong in the world, and a new Hitler killing off the people of Ukraine while we watch on large screen TVs. On our last day in Haiti, though, we went to this children's tuberculosis hospital. I don't know whose idea it was. I wish they hadn't had it. But we went to this children's tuberculosis hospital where children were in various stages of dying from a preventable disease. And it was more than I could take. I was holding one child who was in the later stages of dying while 2 others were grabbing onto my skirt. And I suddenly noticed that my group was leaving. They were on their way out the gate, and I could not put this baby down, and I could not leave because I didn't have anything that I could do. And suddenly, in that situation, I just began to ugly cry. Been there? And so I was just crying and not knowing what to do, and suddenly this lady came over to me, and she pressed into my hand 3 pieces of candy. And then I had something to give. And so I was able, with gifts of candy, to disconnect myself from 3 precious children and to walk out those gates. Later that night, we sat on a hillside overlooking the city of Port-au-Prince. And some wise professor who was with us gave us time to sit in silence. And I sat in silence looking at the lights of that city and talked to Jesus about what it would mean now for me to follow. I knew I couldn't go back to the way things had been, but I didn't know what the future would look like. And it was almost as if Jesus said to me, I want you to remember that moment in the Children's Tuberculosis Hospital, and I want you to remember those 3 pieces of candy. And if you will always be faithful wherever I send you to stretch out your hand, I will always be faithful to give you something to give. And so that night, on a hillside in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, I said a yes that has lasted all these years. I returned from the trip, and the next week I marched into chapel, and I preached this text, John 21. My sermon that day was directed at myself, as maybe all good sermons are. I was making a decision right there on the precipice of leaving Trevecca with a huge unknown future ahead of me. Whether or not I loved Jesus. Not just loved Jesus, whether or not I loved Jesus. Whether I loved him enough to follow him if the road got hard, if he called me to difficult places, if the ladders I was called to climb went down instead of up? If he called me into hiddenness? If he called me to take up my cross and lay down my life for the sake of the world? Which, by the way, is indeed the call to each of us. When I realized that I had my one shot at preaching for this 30 years in chapel today, I wanted to preach so many things. But the only clear direction that I felt was to return to John 21. Because this story happens right after the resurrection, precisely where we sit today on this first day back in chapel right after Easter. And it also happens when the disciples are trying to figure out what life is going to look like after what they've witnessed, the death and the resurrection of Jesus. They are in what we call a liminal space. It's like a door threshold. They can't go back to the way things were before, but they also have no idea what's out in front. And I just imagine there's more than one someone in the crowd who can relate to that. Here at the end of a school year, for many of you at the end of a college career. The story in this text takes us to the days right after the first Easter, when the resurrection was so new that no one could even begin to wrap their heads around it. I always pictured this happening like in the next few days right after Easter, but if you stop and think about it, quite a bit has happened. Jesus is now appearing for the third time. There was a week in between a couple of those, and now this is the third time. But we also know that the disciples at this point had traveled by foot 70 or 80 miles back to the Sea of Galilee, back to where it all began, back to home. I wonder what those days of journeying would have been like with so much spinning in their heads. In the week before the resurrection, they had been part of a strangely wonderful and strangely weird entry into Jerusalem. They were hailed by the crowds, not quite the way they had pictured it. They weren't riding on horses beside Jesus as king in robes and crown. In fact, Jesus was on a donkey and they were walking, but at least they got to be part of the parade. And they were full of hope that day. But then in a matter of days, a matter of hours, it all turned sour, and they watched as Jesus was arrested and then tried and then unbelievably crucified. The disciples are filled with so many emotions. So much has happened that they don't know how to process. And hanging in the air in this story is the question of what their lives will be like now that all that's happened. They thought that they were following the leader of a revolution that would take over the Roman Empire and fix their situation. And they really did think that they were going to be the new cabinet. So now what are they going to be? Do you know that kid in every family who acts out all the stress that the family is feeling? Maybe you are that kid. In this story, that kid is Peter. Peter makes brash promises that he'll never be able to keep. He tries walking on water. He whips out a sword and slices off a guy's ear. He follows to stay near Jesus while Jesus is heading to his trial. But then he denies Jesus 3 times. You can just imagine how Peter feels when he hears that rooster crow and realizes all of that's come true and he has failed. And he hasn't even understood what was going on. And now it's over. But then it isn't over, because then there's resurrection. And that's also stressful. You know, even good stress is stress, right? And so if Peter were to take one of those tests in your psychology class that measures stress level, he would be off the chart. As are we, after 2 years of COVID, at the end of a school year with everything due in just a week, yes, just a week, and graduation looming and a whole future out in front of us. It is no wonder that Peter makes the announcement, I'm going to go back fishing. Now, we don't know exactly what he means by this. Was this just a little fishing trip? I just need a little normalcy. A night on the water will be just the thing. a night like old times? Or was he going back fishing thinking that returning to his old career was all that was left to him? Jesus had called him out of fishing on this very shore. Had he decided to give it all up and return to normal? Whatever it was, his friends say, "We'll go with you." But I like to think that Peter can't be out there on the water without remembering that other time when Jesus called him out of the boat and he walked on water toward Jesus until he got scared and failed again. So many thoughts, so many memories, so much pain, kicking himself, scared for tomorrow, up all night thinking and fishing. And then he even fails at the fishing. Even his backup plan for his life doesn't seem to be working. And then suddenly, as the dawn is breaking, in those hazy moments before we can clearly see, somebody is on the shore. And a bunch of deja vu moments kind of follow in which they realize that it's Jesus. He fills their empty nets, just like he did another time. And they realize it's Jesus, and Peter jumps over the side of the boat and swims to shore. And there is a charcoal fire, just like another time. In fact, the only other time a charcoal fire appears in all the Gospels is the fire Peter stood by when he denied Jesus. And then Jesus breaks bread with them, just like another time. But this isn't the Last Supper. This is the first breakfast. So they have a breakfast on the beach with grilled fish and bread served by Jesus himself. After fishing all night, it must have tasted wonderful, and yet I wonder if they could swallow with the lumps in their throats. But it is really after breakfast where I want to take us this morning, because Jesus takes Peter on a walk along the shore. The water is splashing gently on the rocky beach. The early morning sun is glistening off the lake. You can still smell the campfire and the smell of roasted fish. Seagulls circling above them, screeching, their footsteps crunching on the sand. And 3 times, Jesus turns to Peter and asks him, "Do you love me?" 3 denials are replaced by 3 new chances. Do you love me? Peter answers Jesus all 3 times that he loves him. And the 3rd time he begins to weep because he knows Jesus knows exactly how fickle his love is. Every time Peter answers that he loves Jesus, Jesus' response to Peter is a call to feed his sheep. It's kind of a weird answer, if you ask me. Not what you expect to hear when you tell someone that you love them. Jesus is saying, Peter, if you love me, you have choices to make. And you will learn to love me more as you make them and live into them. I am calling you to be a shepherd, not a fisherman. All of life changes right here if you say yes. Do you love me? Feed my sheep. Not many, if any of us, know the life of a shepherd, but it isn't a glamorous one. It involves lonely hours, odd smells. Sometimes it's the sheep, but after a couple of days, it's you. There are no awards given for Shepherd of the Year, no 401ks. You risk life and limb to rescue dumb animals who keep getting themselves into crazy predicaments, and no one notices, and no one tells you you're amazing. I don't know a single famous shepherd. I don't think one has ever made the cover of Time magazine. Shepherding most certainly wasn't what Peter had in mind when he followed Jesus to begin with. But he knows now what this path looks like because he watched Jesus give himself up to the mob in the garden. He followed behind him to his trial. He watched as they mocked him, as they pressed a crown of thorns on his head. He looked on from a distance as Jesus hung dying a shameful criminal's death. A life laid down for the sheep. A life shaped by the cross. It's a lot more clear than it was a few weeks ago. Peter, do you love me? then feed my sheep. It's like Jesus is saying, can I be honest with you, Peter? Impetuous Peter, always first to jump out into the water, Peter. Dear, headstrong Peter. When you were younger, you could get yourself dressed and head out to do whatever you pleased. You knew no limits. Hey, you could even fish naked if you wanted. But if you follow me, the day will come when you don't get to choose your path, when you will be taken in a direction that you did not choose, that left to your own devices you would not choose. You will die, Peter. This path leads to laying down your life for me. Will you take it? Now, a little side note here. The final editor of this book is putting it together decades later, and he knows what Peter doesn't know that morning. That Peter will die by crucifixion in AD 68. Crucifixion, just like Jesus. Another little thing that we need to know to understand what happens in the story right here is that the author of this book only ever calls himself the beloved disciple. There are some debates about who this is. He's called the beloved disciple by himself at every point in the book, which makes me wonder, is this guy okay? Have you ever known someone who talks about themselves in the third person? Tell your mother the truth. Do not lie to your mother. Tell your mother right now who did this. It's a weird habit. But that's what the beloved disciple does as he writes this. He's writing this story and he calls himself the disciple that Jesus loved. My husband has an ongoing joke with his siblings that he is his parents' favorite. It is a ridiculous and potentially offensive thing to say, to call yourself the favorite, the one that's loved the most. But the story says this: the disciple that Jesus loved was following them on the beach that morning. You know, the one who got to be right next to Jesus at the Last Supper, the one who got to lean against him. So as Peter and Jesus are having this conversation, Peter turns and he sees the one all of them think is Jesus' favorite. At least the one who constantly reminds them that he is Jesus' favorite. And Peter's just heard that if he follows Jesus, he will be called to downward mobility. He'll lose his freedom. He'll follow Jesus to the cross. And he looks around and sees the next guy. And Peter says, Lord, what about him? This is our temptation, isn't it? We always want God to tell us someone else's story. We have trained ourselves into so much comparison with the next person. What about him? What about her? Does he have to die too? Or does he get to be famous while I do work that is lowly and lonely? Seriously, Jesus, what about him? And Jesus answers him, if I want him to stay alive until I come back, what is that to you? You must follow me. 30 years ago, I preached myself into that decision as a senior in college at Trevecca. 30-some years ago. A little bit more than 30. Almost 18 years ago now, though, I got to stand on the beach where this happened. It was a highlight of my trip to Israel because this was kind of a life verse for me. My heart swelled to picture Jesus on the beach walking with Peter, and so that morning I wanted to make sure I got to take a walk on the beach with Jesus. But it was a rough time in our lives. We were on this trip to Israel with other missionaries from the field where we served. We'd been serving in Russia and Ukraine, and we were on this trip with missionary colleagues. And we loved the life that we had been called to. But we were on this trip, and there was a doctor on our team. And the night before, the doctor had told us that we needed to leave on a medical leave. My husband, John, wasn't feeling well. We didn't know what was wrong. And on the trip to Israel, it had become increasingly clear that something was really wrong. And so that day, as we walked on the beach, it felt like things were falling apart. And so I walked on the beach with Jesus, and I needed to have this conversation all over again. I think I sensed that morning that maybe our time in Russia was coming to an end, at least that there was that possibility, and I was grieving already. I remember looking back over my shoulder and seeing other missionaries standing in a cluster not far from the water, and you know where this is going. What about them? I was so jealous that they would get to keep living the life that I loved while I walked into an unknown future again. What is that to you? You must follow me. Again and again, I return to this passage when I stand in liminal spaces, and I always hear the call again. I may have told Jesus I would follow him a long time ago, but somehow it means more, and I need to say it again. And I wonder if somebody here this morning isn't needing to take a walk on the beach with Jesus. Things have happened that you did not expect. What is that to you? You must follow me. Other Christians seem so hypocritical. What is that to you? You must follow me. The church has hurt you, and it's hurt people you love, and I get that, and I don't excuse it, but you have to decide what you will do with Jesus. What is that to you? You must follow me. It would be so much easier to settle down and do something great and make a name for yourself. And it seems like some of your friends get to do that. What is that to you? You must follow me. The call to follow Jesus is a call to come and die, to give your life away, to become a shepherd instead of a celebrity, to live a life shaped by the cross, to pour out your life to see new creation burst into this world, to trust that if you follow Jesus to his death, you follow him to resurrection. And maybe right here at the end of a school year, after a long, bewildering season of COVID, with the world at war and gas prices rising and climate issues out of control and so many places of brokenness in our world, right here for some of you at the end of a college career with so much unknown out in front of you, maybe you just need to have a walk on the beach with Jesus. Some of us need to count the cost again and decide if we will follow him to the cross. Will we let him take our life and let him do with it like he did the bread at the Last Supper? Bless it and break it and give it for the life of the world? Do we really love him? Jesus has built a fire and made breakfast. And he'd like to have a conversation with you. If you'd like to pray, the altars are open.
The altars are open if you want to come. I surrender all to you. Everything I give to you. Withholding nothing. Withholding nothing. I surrender all to you. Everything I give to you. Withholding nothing. Withholding nothing. I give myself away. Oh, I give myself away so you can use me. I give myself away. I surrender.
I surrender all
To you.
to you.
Everything
Everything
I give
I give
to
to
you. You can stand and worship if you want to. Withholding nothing.
holding nothing,
Withholding nothing.
holding nothing.
Lord, I surrender
I
all.
surrender all to you.
Here I am again. Everything
Everything
I
give to you.
withholding nothing.
Holding nothing,
Withholding nothing.
holding
Give
nothing.
myself away.
Give myself away.
Oh, I give myself.
Give myself away.
So you. Here I am again. I give myself.
Give myself away.
I humble myself. Even my ambition and dreams, I give myself.
Give myself away.
So you. Oh, let's sing that again. I give myself away.
Give myself
All my dreams, all my ambitions, I give it all to you, Jesus.
I give myself away.
So you can use me. I give myself to you.
Give myself away.
Oh, I give myself to you, Jesus.
I give myself
Oh,
away. So you can use me.
say I surrender.
I surrender all to you.
Even my hurt, everything
Everything
I give to you.
I give
Even my disappointment, withholding nothing,
holding nothing,
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 withholding nothing.
holding nothing.
I give myself to you.
Holding nothing,
Withholding nothing.
holding nothing,
Withholding nothing.
holding nothing,
Withholding nothing.
holding nothing,
My answer is yes.
holding nothing,
My answer is yes.
holding nothing,
My answer is yes.
holding nothing,
I'm withholding nothing.
holding nothing,
Withholding nothing.
holding nothing,
Withholding nothing.
holding nothing,
Withholding nothing. Yeah.
holding nothing.
Oh, yeah. We're holding nothing, yeah. It all belongs to you anyway, yes. 'Cause all I want is you. Oh, all I want is you. Can you tell the Father that today? All I want
is you.
Oh, you're all I want, yeah.
All I want is you.
Oh, nothing else matters. All I want,
All I
as
want
a deer pants for the water, so my soul longs for you. As a deer pants for the water, so my soul longs for you. As a deer pants for the water, so my soul longs for you. As a deer pants for the water, so my soul longs for you. As a deer pants for the water, so my soul longs for you. As a deer pants for the water, so my soul longs for you.
A scripture that is moving in my heart is today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. Friends, as you go from this place, may you sense Jesus inviting you, calling you, walking with you, giving you a vision for what it might mean to follow him next. And may you say yes. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Spirit. Everybody said, amen. Have a great day, friends.
Withholding nothing.